Welcome to Coffee with Gaz, episode 6. This week, this episode rather, I'm not necessarily going to be touching on a specific question, but rather a comment that was presented to me by one of my clients that is a really important thing to elaborate on a bit, because this is something that we see a lot in the fitness industry, in healthcare in general, I guess, less so these days with the kind of evidence-based medicine movement, but still really important to consider. So let's just get into it. Basically, this is the topic of what I would refer to as physiological hypothesizing, or you could just call it mechanistic reasoning, basically without considering empirical evidence. And what I mean by that is making a specific decision based on an isolated mechanism, or maybe multiple mechanisms, in the absence of, or while ignoring, actual empirical interventional evidence. And an example of that would be if one was to make an argument for the use of a particular supplement in a particular patient population based on some, maybe a biochemical pathway, let's say. So making the case for that supplement based on basic biochemistry, where we actually have evidence where the supplement has been given to a similar population with no effect. So the mechanism makes sense. The mechanism for using that supplement seems to make sense on a basic textbook level, but in the real world, when that supplement is used, it doesn't actually have the effect that one would assume that it would have. Okay? That's a really important concept to actually think about, because this happens every day, all the time, in nutrition, in physiotherapy, lots of different kind of peripheral areas of the health and fitness industry, you could say, where people will make a justification for some sort of intervention, some sort of supplement, some sort of diet based on an isolated mechanism without actually citing or paying respect to the evidence that we actually have that have used this intervention as an intervention in a controlled setting. This evidence, where we have, let's say, randomized controlled trials, is generally going to be far more useful than pure mechanistic reasoning, okay? And that is the case for a lot of things, not necessarily always. It doesn't necessarily mean that the randomized controlled trial is what we should only focus on and what we should always focus on. That's not the case, especially in nutrition. But in this case, if you've got a controlled trial that shows this intervention is not better than placebo, yet we've got mechanistic evidence suggesting that, oh, maybe this should work based on this isolated mechanism, this is a better thing to use, that interventional evidence. Because what interventional evidence is telling you is that when this supplement or this intervention was given to a population, or a specific population, let's say it's a population very similar to you, it had no positive effects, or maybe it even had negative effects, then you know that in the real world this is unlikely to have an effect on you. So do you trust some basic biochemistry, or do you trust actual real world evidence? And in the vast majority of cases, it would make more sense to trust the real world evidence where you have observed and measured in a controlled environment, as opposed to just the basic science level. So that's something that's important to get, because very often I think what people think of when they think of science is they think of the fancy mechanistic reasoning as being the product of science, and it is to some degree, but they think that is what it means to be a scientific thinker, what it means to be sciencey, so to speak, and to be science-based, that you have to always have this reasoning and to be saying, this supplement acts on this pathway which interacts with this pathway and activates this protein or decreases the expression of this gene, and that all sounds really sexy and it's brilliant and it's lovely when it all fits together. But when we've got all that, we've got that whole theory going, and it disagrees with experiment, then you basically gotta ditch the theory. That's a classic Richard Feynman quote, where he's like, it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, if it disagrees with experiment, go back to the drawing board, get rid of it. It's not something that we're interested in, because what we're interested in is some sort of real world outcome. So you don't want to be spending extra money, you don't want to be not getting the health benefits that you're trying to get based on just reasoning that you're hoping is going to work out. So if you've got real world evidence, you want to rely on that, okay? So that's really important to consider and to think about. And a more applied example of this in this sort of diet world would be something like low carbohydrate diets, let's say. So when you look at the landscape of evidence related to how these diets are basically applied in the real world, for example, lower fat diets, lower carbohydrate diets, both in the context of healthy diets, so where one is consuming lots of whole foods, foods that we typically consider to be healthful, then what you see is that it doesn't really seem to matter whether one consumes a low fat or a low carbohydrate diet when it comes to weight loss, fat loss. And the point there being that a lot of people will come up with theoretical reasons, mechanistic justifications, physiological hypothesizing based on the basic role of insulin in the body, or things like de novo lipogenesis. And they come up with these basic biochemical justifications for why low carbohydrate diets would be better, which sounds really convincing to the average person listening or reading. So you've got these real nice mechanisms that seem to all slot together and it all sounds really sciencey, whereas it doesn't sound quite as sciencey to just say, we've got this evidence from trials to show that it doesn't matter which you choose, okay? It just doesn't really matter, they both work. In that case, what you've got to say is, all right, that theory is really nice, but we've actually got to ditch it in favor of the real world experiments. So where we have experiment to show that something is not the case or is not as simple as presented through basic mechanisms, we've got to rethink our theory. We've got to refute that theory and come up with some different conjecture as to why why we are observing what we're observing in the real world. Okay, and in terms of like making decisions in the real world, which most of you are trying to make, you're trying to make decisions, you're not too worried about what the particular mechanism is, like checking out what the experiments are saying is what is really most important. And those experiments may not always reflect the way that you would execute something in the real world, or they may not be carried out in populations similar to you. So you may have to maybe be somewhat cautious as to whether or not that applies to you. But the vast majority of the time, if you've got those experiments showing superiority, inferiority, or the things are equal, then you can start to make some decisions based on those outcomes, okay? So, point being there, don't seek mechanistic reasoning for dietary decisions. Well, you can seek it out, but don't seek it at the expense of experimental evidence that's actually telling you how you should behave in the real world. Because it's like there's so many, like human physiology and like the way humans actually work, the way we work as Homo sapiens, it's really complicated, and there's many different things interacting, and that's particularly the case when it comes to nutrition. Because when we're talking about nutrition, anytime you change some sort of input, you're changing countless other things. A key point there being like there's no placebo for food because people have to eat. So that's really important, because when people go on a low carbohydrate diet, let's say, you're not just changing the carbohydrate count. So you can't change that in isolation without changing overall energy content of the diet, unless you happen to compensate through other nutrients, through other foods, which often tend to be protein based. So very often what you see is that in low carbohydrate diets, what people tend to do is they eat more protein and they spontaneously reduce their caloric intake. So low carbohydrate diets, they can be fantastic, but the mechanisms might be a little bit different to what we would initially predict if we were to only look at isolated biochemical pathways, say. So that's really important to get. It's really important to get that physiological hypothesizing does not always work. It's not always reliable just to look at an isolated pathway, okay? It might be useful to initially come up with some sort of conjecture and say, oh, you know what, it seems to be the case that this mechanism would lead to this real world outcome, and that's your conjecture. But then when you've got experiment to refute that, you say, oh, that was actually, we actually missed the mark there, we need to change that, we need to come up with a new conjecture to go and test that then in the future. So you start to think of things in terms of that. What you don't want is to get stuck to that mechanism and to get stuck to that physiological hypothesis where experiment has told you that it is incorrect, or it's maybe missing the mark a little bit, okay? So that's the way you want to be thinking when you're trying to be a scientific thinker, is that we need to update our potential reliance on those mechanisms, on those physiological hypotheses, when experiment is showing us that we're not necessarily correct in this case. And like that would seem to be really intuitive, and many of you listening to this are probably thinking, yeah, that obviously makes a lot of sense. But what often happens in the real world is that people want to cling to those explanations because they seem so beautiful and they're simple, and it's like, oh, this is fantastic, look, insulin explains all of the problems with our health. It's all because carbohydrates increase insulin, and that's the sole problem. But when you've got experiments to the contrary, they're showing you that this theory is incomplete, the scientific thinker would say, okay, here's all the experimental evidence that we have, here are the things that we know not to be true, and you remain humble in the way that you try to understand the workings of the world, the workings of the body, the workings of nutrition and its interaction with physiology. Because basically what you're saying is that we have incomplete knowledge, but we've got experimental evidence to at least help us to make decisions in the real world. So let's start to make some decisions, but recognize that there are still holes in our knowledge and that we don't necessarily understand it all in an all-encompassing manner. The typical way that the pseudoscientist or the anti-scientific thinker will present their thesis of the world is that this is an all-encompassing theory, and that's the classic case of carbohydrates being the devil, that we can explain all modern healthcare or modern ailments with carbohydrates bad, and there are some people like that, unfortunately, and it's not the majority of people, of course. And again, low carbohydrate diets can be fantastic, but that's why we just ask you to basically be somewhat cautious when you're thinking about those mechanistic reasons. And this goes further into the world of physiotherapy and training as well. For example, when we start to look at, let's say, explanations as to why people have back pain, okay? You could look at an isolated study on collagen and how it behaves inside a petri dish and assume that relates to the pain experience. But there's so many steps coming up from those isolated cells to tissues, to organs, to the interaction with the nervous system, to consciousness, etc., that you could not just assume that that's going to explain our whole worldview, that that's going to explain our full understanding of pain and why people have low back pain based on a petri dish study. Similarly, if you're looking at studies that are using bovine spines, so pig spines, and they're just moving them in isolation without the body, and they're seeing when the intervertebral disc, when you're trying to see when that starts to break down or degenerate, or when the nucleus pulposus, the disc starts to bulge basically. If you're looking at all of that might give you some insight into the properties within those conditions, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what's going on in the real world. And a good example of that would be, all of the research in asymptomatic individuals showing us that a large proportion of asymptomatic individuals with no symptoms living their lives have bulging discs, have degenerative disc disease, have these different changes on MRI that we would consider typically to be pathological, such as tendinopathy in some cases, bony spurs, all these different changes that can happen in the body that we typically associate with pathology. The reason that is insightful is because it gives us an understanding that our simple mechanistic reasoning related to pain is not necessarily complete, and that we can't necessarily assume that the presence of some abnormality, so to speak, on an MRI is equal to the pain experience that someone has presented with. So when someone presents to a physiotherapist or an orthopedic surgeon or whatever, and there happens to be a finding on an MRI, one has to always ask, is this incidental, or is this the quote-unquote cause of this pain experience? And where that becomes even more relevant then is when you look at research on sham surgeries, for example. Sham surgery studies will include things like the knee, the meniscus. That's been a topic of study in recent years, and in 2013 there was a study basically showing us, and there's been others since, if I recall correctly, that basically show us that these surgeries that would be assumed to reduce pain because of the mechanistic reasoning that we fix the meniscus, we fix the pain, boom, simple, tissue damage gone, that they're no better than placebo, than sham surgeries. So again, it gives us this insight that, oh, our mechanistic reasoning is incomplete, but we start to use those experiments to then guide real world decisions. So you can start to guide the real world decision that maybe surgery isn't necessarily the best option and there might be something else. So the experimental evidence starts to adjust our reasoning and that we can't solely rely on those mechanistic theories. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. I've tried to give a couple of different examples, like related to a supplement, related to the diet, related to physiotherapy. You know, you can see this again in resistance training. For example, one may assume that more soreness is equal to more muscle gain, for example, because someone might say that, oh, it seems like there's this isolated mechanism that if we break down muscle tissue, it's going to build back up. Like, that's the understanding from some people, and people might assume that might be the case. And the same thing, you know, anytime you try to isolate any mechanism, whether it's a growth factor, for example, an increase in growth hormone during your workout, or the increase in testosterone, you start to look at these isolated mechanisms and assume that might be all encompassing. But then you can start to get led astray when you start to make decisions based on that. One example of that, I know I'm going around in circles a bit, but I'm trying to basically shotgun you with all these examples to try and get this point across. But when you look at something like growth hormone, a lot of people will say, when you fast before a workout, you can increase your growth hormone and that's going to lead to more muscle gain. However, while that makes sense as an isolated mechanism, it goes against other mechanisms and experimental evidence. So if you were to say that, then you'd be basically ignoring the fact that, food, the energy from food actually fuels training and fuels the subsequent anabolic response. So if you're just looking solely at growth hormone, you can get led astray. So yeah, I won't give you too many other examples because the point wasn't to totally drag this out into a massive discussion of all the potential places we've gone wrong with physiological hypothesizing. The point was to get the point across that physiological hypothesizing or biochemical hypothesizing or physical hypothesizing, whatever you want to call it, it's incomplete without experiment. And it can be useful, and it's more useful where you consider it in terms of a model, so different mechanisms interacting together. Like, for example, so one mechanism might increase something, but one might coexist with it to decrease something else, and you have to consider those interactions. So obviously you can create solid mechanistic reasoning when you start to consider the different mechanisms, but experiment is super important. And that doesn't mean it's always relevant to you, because you might have an experiment that, the patient population just wasn't like you. You know, it's a beginner. You're an advanced trainee. They were 70 years old. You're 20 years old. So the experiment mightn't be perfect. And then you try to find experiments that are more relevant to try and complete your understanding. That's it for this video, guys. If you've got comments, questions, etc., drop them down below. I'll be discussing future questions in these kind of Coffee with Gaz episodes. They're supposed to be kind of Q&A, but if there's a topic that I feel is relevant that's coming up in check-ins or anything like that, I'll basically discuss that. So if you got those questions, drop them down below. Of course, remember that it is too easy, and be happy.